doing a series in James, James all day, every day. And last week we looked at James, beginning first few verses, James chapter 1, about how to deal with problems. And remember in the intro that James was speaking to believers, particularly the persecuted believers that have been scattered. And you need to keep that in your mind, because today we're going to talk about something that's probably maybe not too popular to talk about from this setting, and maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but nothing more practical. And James is a super practical book. We all have problems. We've talked about problems. Now today, we all experience the pressure of temptation and sin. And so we're going to talk about what to do with that this morning, and James talks about it. Now, before I get going, I need to tell you that I worked really hard last week. I was so quick. I surprised the worship team, so maybe not this week. I'm trying to fit this all in this morning. I actually heard a joke. There was a pastor that was preaching, and he was particularly famous for his long-winded sermons. And at one particular sermon, he was preaching, and as he got started and going, one of the board members got up and left. And then a little while later, the board member came back and sat down. And so afterwards, the pastor asked the board member for coffee and said, "I noticed during the sermon last Sunday, you left and came back. Why did you leave and come back?" And the board member said, "Well, I had to get my hair cut." And the pastor said, "Well, okay, but isn't that something you could have done if you needed a haircut, you could have done before service?" He goes, "Well, I didn't need it before service." Some of you get the idea of it eventually. I promise you, your hair will not need a cut unless it already needed one before. We'll get this done. Oscar Wilde, when he's talking about temptation, he usually has something to say about something. Always has something to say about anything, actually. He said, "I can resist almost anything except temptation." He also said, "The best way to deal with temptation is to yield to it." Well, that's not very good advice, is it? I don't think he was right. So if that's not what we're supposed to do, what are we supposed to do with temptation? Well, we're going to read 3 verses, verse 13 to 18, and then we'll get into it. "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of the truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created." Heavenly Father, I pray that as we look into these words, and as James wrote them as practical advice to believers, we receive them today. We believe in you, but we want our belief to become biography. We want to walk out our faith. And so I pray you will help us in this text as we turn to you. Speak to us through your word in Jesus' name. Amen. So first of all, before we get started, and we're going to look about James, then we're going to hop over into Mark for a practical, and then we're going to end up with a God story, a really cool God story at the end of the service. Knowing the source and the motives of temptation can help you fight against it. It's important to establish, before we go any farther, that when you are tempted, where does this temptation come from? Now, it's interesting, James starts talking about where it does not come from. It is not God tempting you. God will test, but as we learned last week, tests are not tests to try to prove that you don't know what you're doing or don't know or you can't do it. They are testing and trials that God gives or things to prove that you can be successful. He will test you so you can go, "Hey, I do it. I can do it." He does not tempt. Tempting is a different thing altogether. Key in being able to deal with temptation is to know its source. Are it the people around me? I mean, perhaps you've heard the phrase, about bad company can corrupt. A misery also loves company. And so those people that make bad choices, they tend to not like people around them that are making good choices. And they try to make the people around them that are making around them that are making good choices to make bad choices with them. You have balcony people and you have basement people. And some people are just the kind of people that says, I'm going to go down and would love it if you would come with me. And they pull us down. I'm not saying it's everybody's fault around us, but we tend to do that. And this one thing is true. It's hard to live right hanging around the wrong people. Really hard. Not impossible, but hard. But the source is not our friends. The source is not our environment. And it's not God. We know what the source is. James speaks about it. It's you and I. That's the root of the problem. Now, it can be traced all the way back to the enemy, to the one who is the father of lies. When you recognize that God's enemy is your enemy, and he has a way of pushing your buttons to try to get you to move away from God and separate you from God, it can help us fight against him. The enemy is the enemy of God. And so his goal is to remove as many people as possible and separate people from God as many times as possible for as long as possible. Sin separates. And so as we move forward, you'll see in this message, and I'm not going to go on talking about sin and banging you over the head and giving you a big list and giving you a big description of each one to make sure we have boxes that we can check and say, yeah, I'm guilty of that one. I'm not going to do that today. But what I am going to do, I want to be able to identify that, first of all, that this is what the enemy is doing in our lives and working in our desires and enticing us and tricking us to make decisions that will separate us from God. And his goal is separation from God. So how do you fight against a goal that separates from God? You draw near to him. That's what you do. Resist the enemy and draw near to God. James says later on in James chapter 4:8. So we're going to do that before we close in the service. Temptation is a lie, designed by the father of lies. I've spoken this phrase before, but when you look at Jacob and Esau, it is the deception of the immediate for the ultimate. Trading in the immediate instead of receiving the ultimate. Trading in the ultimate, to receive the immediate. We all fight the fight. We all are enticed. We all are under this battle. We all are in the same war. We may not all fight the same battle, but we're in the same war. James 1:14. Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away. So I wanted to make the point that not only it's you and I that are ones that are the problem, but it's also there's a uniqueness and a specialness. I remember Pastor Dave preaching about this a while ago, and he says what's tempting to him might not be tempting to you, whether it's a double-double or, for me, my most likely danger thing for me, if you want to, for instance, for eating, my easiest way to have a snack accident is a bag of chips. You know a snack accident, right? When you go to just eat a few, and before you know it, you've eaten the whole bag. That's a snack accident. And so for me, it's salt. I mean, it's not really sugar, dessert, pop, and salt. I mean, that'll get me every time. I can eat lots of different. It makes you feel good. People go, "You would like a dessert?" No, thank you. No, thank you. Wow, such discipline. Yeah, put a bag of chips in front of me, I'm gone. But other people, you might not be tempted with things I'm tempted with. Each has their own. Pastor Dave talked about this a while ago. It was really, really good, great message. It's easy to be judgmental, though, when we don't have the same pull towards that thing. When we see someone giving into it. Oh, come on, how come we just can't say no to that? You know, how good are you at saying no to the things that tempt you? So we need a little more grace, a little more mercy. We recognize that they're being dragged away and enticed the same way we get dragged away and enticed. It might not be the same thing, but we're in the same war. Temptations are lies that eventually consume and hurt you. Enticed. That word jumped out at me. Enticed and dragged away. I didn't like those phrases. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desires. And then verse 16, don't be deceived. We all have bowed down at the altar of self too many times. We're blinded by it so that we can't even see the effect it's having on our lives and the lives of those around us. It is time to declare war on temptation. To fight the enemy, and the best way to fight him is to square him off. Llama illustration. Now, this is great. I've been studying, Pam and I went to Peru for a 20th anniversary, and there's alpacas there, and I was looking at all these strange creatures. This is a llama. One thing I didn't know about a llama is how bold these creatures are. You know, farmers for years have been trying to figure out how to protect their sheep. I mean, they've used staff in the old days. They've tried to use fences and dogs and guns. And how can we defend? Do you know that a very popular rising option is llamas? Llamas. This aggressive, funny-looking, afraid-of-nothing animal. When it spots it, yeah, I know, I saw that one. I couldn't resist. Right? It's like, the howdy partner. This animal, when it sees a coyote or a dog or a predator coming into the cage fenced-in area, the first thing this animal does is start going right towards it. Starts running towards this animal. And if that coyote doesn't run away, it'll start kicking and pawing and scraping and butting. And when it sits on the run, that llama will put the chase on that coyote. He is not thinking about sheep anymore. He's thinking about saving his life. That llama is danger. They don't be prepared to be afraid of anything. A guy, CBC did an article. Nova Scotian farmer Bob Ottenbright said, quote, Crystal, a white llama he owns, this is Crystal, would give you a kiss if you approached her. But if you get anything that looks like a coyote in there, everything changes. That fluffy body beats a heart of a warrior. Should a coyote be foolish enough to enter into my pasture, the 100 sheep are safe. And that coyote has bit off more than he can chew. Something else, he was talking about this llama. He said something that really hit me as well. He says, if the sheep stay within the fence, the llamas do a 100% job of keeping them safe. But if they happen to get through the fence somehow and out on their own, the coyotes are waiting for them. Coyotes are opportunists, and the llamas take that opportunity away. Resist the devil, and he will flee. I love this illustration just for the twofold way. Number one, how can we face sin? And not only that, how can we help those around us? We need to be able to be a little bit like the llamas in our own life. And when sin comes and temptation comes, we resist it. We fight it. Number two, we fight the temptation and the sin of the lives of those we care about that we're around. We protect those we care about. And we put the boots to temptation when it threatens those we love. So how do we attack temptation at the source? This is where I want to take us to Mark chapter 12. And we've studied this text before, but not in the context of temptation. I just want to bring us, rather than focusing on the negative, I want to focus on the positive and how we can fight it by doing something positive. Mark chapter 12, Jesus was in a debate with some religious leaders. I'll read it and then we'll explain how it can help us today. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating and noticed that Jesus had given a good answer. And he asked them, all of the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, love the Lord our God. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than this. So here it is. If we want to fight temptation, and we all face it, something needs to change. You need to make a decision to make a change. And that change needs to start today. You need to change your allegiance. You need to change your affection. You need to change your attention. And you need to change your action. First of all, we change our desires or our allegiance. Remember, this book is written to people who were being persecuted. So what possibly sins could they be dealing with? I'll tell you a big one. The desire for revenge, bitterness, resentment, all sins. Oh, maybe not the one you're thinking of because it's, the do not murder. I don't murder, so I'm good. Yeah, maybe. Or gossip. It's interesting. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. It's interesting how sometimes, especially one of the enemy's tools are pain or offense. Because when we're hurt, we begin to be self-focused. And we can get our attention off God, we get our attention on ourselves. And as soon as the enemy gets attention on ourselves, he starts winning. We need to change our heart's desires. It's almost impossible to live the right life if we have the wrong desire. How do we go about changing our heart? Well, number one, very quickly, you need to admit that God is not first place in your life. You're living for yourself, or you're living for a name, or you're living to be successful, or you're living just to be able to get back at that person. But something has been replaced in your life. God has moved out, and this thing has moved in. To ask God to help you to change. That's the second part, you see, because you just can't change on your own. There's a heart change that needs to happen. In a few moments, we'll talk about how God helped do a bit of a heart surgery on someone in the church just when they were serving out and helping. And it was a pretty amazing testimony what God did. We can surrender to Him. That's where it begins for us. And then we need Him to give us a new heart. Some people might say, well, one day I'm going to get my act together. And when I get myself, I remember hearing someone say, I just need to get myself together and then I'm going to come to God. No, don't believe that lie. You can't do that. That's like getting yourself in the place where you can drive yourself to the hospital. If there's a reason why we have ambulances, because every now and then you get in a state where you can't get yourself to the place where you need to go to get help. And sometimes, and yes, always God is able to help. But let me tell you what, you can't help yourself and put you in a place, because sometimes you're in such a deep, dark place that you need God to come to you where you are. And He does. Light comes to darkness. So it's not about making yourself clean yourself up, buttoning your shirt up, iron out the wrinkles, get everything right, then I'm going to come to God, and then He'll accept me. No, He'll accept you where you are. He'll go wherever He needs to go to bring you back. He's that kind of shepherd. But you have to sign the consent form. He doesn't do heart surgery on anyone without permission. Heart surgery. A great example is David. In Psalm 51, he writes about after having this giving in to temptation. Interesting, David's temptation is all the same things outlined here in James. David, first of all, was idle. And then after his idle, he had interest. He was out on a balcony and saw a woman bathing. After the interest, inquiry. Started to ask about her. After inquiry, invitation. Arranged a meeting. After invitation, indulgence. Bang, 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 bang. 1, 2, 3, 4. The steps of every temptation. It's idleness, it's interest, it's inquiry, it's invitation, and then indulgence. After all of that, he felt burdened, guilty, shame. And then he asks God, cries out to God, create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a right spirit in me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore in me the joy of your salvation and grant in me a willing spirit to sustain me. Have you lost the joy of your salvation? Do you feel apart, separate from God? Wherever you are, however far you feel you've gone, cry out to Him. This was more than just an ask for a new heart. It was a blanket permission that David was giving God. I'll give you another one. God will give you a new heart if you ask for it. just before the text that Betty mentioned earlier in Ezekiel 37. I had planned to share from Ezekiel 36. This is an example where she was talking about the dry bones, and God's people had turned away and had yielded in temptation for so long. They were a long ways away from God. And he says in chapter 36 of Ezekiel, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your old heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God. A new heart. That last phrase is very important in Hebrew, in the Old Testament. You will be my people. I will be your God. It's a covenant. It's an agreement. You see, to delight yourself in God, and he will give you the desires of your heart. That give you the desires of your heart has to be preceded by delight yourself in God. And when you go to God and you put him as your focus, he changes your heart and gives you godly desires. Something else to change, your passions. You see, because your problems, and when James, we know these people, they were dealing with persecution and some big trials. And the thing about trials and persecutions is they can distract us. If the love of God is the driving force behind all you do, then the temptation will have a hard time of getting traction in your life. Talking about preventative today rather than just reactive. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. A fence at the top of the cliff is better than a hospital at the bottom. Not as much money in a fence, more money in fixing people after they've fallen. But we're trying to, how can we create some boundaries in our life and some attitudes that can guard us against temptation? Your passions. Love the Lord your God with all your soul. In the Hebrew thinking, the soul is the seat of will and emotion. In other words, it's the passions. It's the beginning of what drives you, what gets you excited. Desire and passion seem very close. So let me just explain a little bit. There's a distinction for them. You can often get it in the dictionary. It's desire is there, and both have a want to be somewhere or something, or an activity, something you want in work, or a person, or a job, a goal. There's desire, but then passion is very strong and even overwhelming. In fact, when you have a passion for something, it is the driving force behind everything you do. What is the driving force behind what you do? It's almost impossible to have the right life if you have the wrong passions. What do you exclude? You see, because passion is so strong, desire goes, yeah, I want that, I want that, I want that, I want that. I have a desire. Desire, as is the beginning of passion, could be, but you can have many different desires at one time. But when you have a passion for something, it is something you want so strongly that you will exclude things because of it. Passion. Therefore, since we have been surrounded by such cloud of witnesses, Hebrews says, let us throw off things that hinder and sin that so easily entangles. So what's your passion going to be then? Run with perseverance. Fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Fix your eyes on him. Passion and desires is spoke of in the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, quote, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. We talk about those. But as it says, against such there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires. And since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step by the Spirit. Temptation has very little control over someone who has their life full of things like patience, goodness, love, kindness, gentleness, self-control. But if we're going to have victory, we have to change our focus. Because what has your allegiance, first of all, then has your affection. And what has your affection has your attention. So we have to change our focus. If your mind and your thinking is in the wrong place, then temptation, when it comes, will overwhelm you. It's impossible to live the right life if we have the wrong focus. Love the Lord your God with all your mind. James, when he's writing, is trying to shift people's focus from a God who would tempt to a God who gives. I mean, we can be wise. We think of thoughts, we think mind, making decisions, knowledge, grow in knowledge. We can grow in knowledge. We can be wise. We can be smart. We can be even street smart. We must remember that focusing on our knowledge, our ability to be able to learn or make good decisions is still focusing on us. We must always remember that we do what we do, we make the decisions when they are right because God has helped us. We must always remember God. We must also always remember as well that in this society there's some things that should not change. Things like integrity, honesty, fairness, loving others, serving, putting others first, giving. If our mind and thinking are in the wrong place, then temptation will overwhelm us. When we are hurt or when we are persecuted like the early church was, the temptation for us is to then develop resentment. And that resentment can make us self-focused. And when we are self-focused, we can do more damage to our life than anyone has done to us before that. We make decisions. We become self-destructive. Minds are focused on ourselves. That's what happened to David. This is where I'm going to meddle a little bit and then I'm going to stop. This is practical and I'm meddling. But if we are focusing on some things, we say, well, this temptation is just so strong, but we need to change what we're focusing on. Okay, I'll start you in light. The young girl, 16, 15, 16, 17, that's reading Bride magazine or 17 magazine, and all it's talking about is dating and this and that and tips for this and how to know you're perfect for one another and all these kind of physical tips and image, and look at all these pictures. Well, you wonder why she then struggles with the thoughts of image? Why then she struggles in ways she relates to people and in dating and why she's always just talking about, if you're reading Bridal magazine at 16, you wonder why you're then being pushed into some decisions you're making with regard to relationships? Because you're focusing on it. You're feeding it. And so when the temptation comes, you've built the hunger already by your attention and your focus. Okay, enough picking on the teens. This is the case for a lot of stuff. If you're always looking at your bank account or you're looking at the neighbor's car or the neighbor's house, when the opportunity comes for you to cut a corner to make a little more money, you're tempted. You're tempted. Or what about even on the internet, some of those websites and pictures and you can get magazines, you can get movies and that put images in front of you of you wonder why? Then does that lead to decisions in real life that will cause you a lot of hurt and a lot of pain? Yeah. I mean, God has created things, created the relationship for a husband and a wife. It's a beautiful thing. But if you constantly bombard yourself with different images and ways where that is tainted, then you will find yourself straying from what is right. You'll be weak in a time of temptation. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the tip is this. Put off the old you and let God give you a new you. Romans talks about this. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by grace given to me, I say to every one of you, Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. This is the true definition of humility. It's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Because when we think of ourselves a lot, we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. So it's not thinking less of yourself, it's not putting yourself down. It's just stop thinking about yourself all the time. Maybe think about those around you. Do not conform, but be transformed. Because it is almost impossible to live the right life with the wrong focus. So these two things, and then we're going to hear the God story. Number one, do not conform. This is active. This is where we come in and our part. It is something that you and I need to do. Just stop conforming. Stop being the old you. You need to say, that's the old me. That's the old way of thinking. That is not me anymore. I am done doing that. It is over. You got to fight that. You got to speak against that. Walk away from it. Close your eyes to it. Close your mouth to it. Close your ears to it. I used to listen to that stuff. I don't listen anymore. I used to say that stuff. I don't say that anymore. I used to look at that stuff. I don't look at that stuff anymore. You need to change and stop and put off what is the old you. Ephesians says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your mind, and to put on a new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. The second part is be transformed. This is a part you can't do. This is something only God can do. It's passive. It's something that God does in our life. When you put off that stuff and get rid of the old you, God replaces it with the new you. Gives you new thoughts, new desires. You wouldn't believe the difference. I remember having someone say to me, just not too long ago, Pastor, I've dealt with this kind of thing in the past, and I haven't dealt with it well. But ever since I've met God, you wouldn't believe in the way I've just totally different the way I'm responding to this situation. I would have never thought I could handle it this way. The focus of your mind, the attitude of Christ. When you make the focus of your mind and you prepare yourself for temptation by making God your focus, His word on your mind and on your lips and in your heart, temptation to worry, get mad, give up, do something destructive, it loses its power. God is not a tempter, He's a giver. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heaven of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits. I'm going to ask Sharon to come. Sharon, you want to come on up? Sharon came to me a while ago and said, Pastor, something happened to me. And Sharon's a great story. She helps out so much in the kitchen, helps out with Pat, and started coming to community house programmings, and then kind of Bible study a little bit, then church, and then after a while, it took a little bit convincing, but and then finally Betty was invited to come over. He came to church and just been a part of who we are now as a church. You're here all the time, serving and caring and sitting right behind me in the front. I always feel like I'm blocking you from the words on the screen, hoping you could somehow see this to worship without me being a hindrance for you. But you shared with something to me, it happened a few weeks ago, and when I was preparing this message just about the kind of our old way of thinking and acting and what can happen sometimes when we're hurt, and God did a change in your life. And then I texted you yesterday and said, would you be willing to share that on Sunday? And you said, sure. So I wonder if you could share with me a little bit about just that kind of, where things were at the beginning, and that kind of struggle at the beginning, and then kind of what happened on that Sunday morning. Put that up in there tight, right up in there. There you go.
A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting there and the pastor was speaking about blessing people, and it was really, I had a real weird feeling, and it was like, okay, I blessed a couple people, but I wasn't done. I was getting, no, you're not finished here. So I went and blessed this person that I was full of resentment and a hate on and wouldn't let go. But I let it go, hoping they did as well, which I think did. And I feel so much better, like a relief, like God relieved the hate inside my stomach that was sickening me, actually.
So that this resentment that was there, it was a secondhand offense kind of resentment.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Like it wasn't something that was done directly to you. It was something done to somebody that you love and care about.
Correct.
And then and they shared with you their side of things, how they were hurt.
Yes.
And so now you were carrying around this secondhand offense.
That had something to do with me, but did not have.
Yeah, and it was affecting you. It was affecting,
Yes.
Tell me a little bit of how that offense affected you in the way you were with your loved ones or with that person. Can you describe that?
I was standoffish and, like I said, had a hate, just, oh my gosh, person's here, or oh my God.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it. Like I said, it was making me sick inside, and that sickness is gone.
Not awesome, eh?
Oh, yes.
And so just so you know what happened that morning, yeah, sure, give God a clap. But the old Sharon would think that way and get that bitterness and chew on it and not like how it tasted. It tasted bitter, but I didn't know what to do with it. That morning, and I remember that morning, it was after the service we talked about, it was Father's Day.
Yes.
And we just at the end of the service, how much people are just begging for a blessing and people just want a blessing. And so we just ended the service by just praying a prayer of blessing on different people. And you had done a few, and the Holy Spirit was telling you, no, you're not done. Bless one more. And the person he tapped you on the shoulder to go talk to was the one.
Correct.
Yeah, of course. God knows exactly what direction to point us in, doesn't he? I mean, sure, I'll bless anybody in the room. How about that one in the room? Well, God, anybody at all except that one. But what happened when you went forward to bless that person at that moment? You offered up and you surrendered your bitterness at that moment right there. And you just said, I mean, you may not realize it, you just went to bless him, but the only way you could do that was say, I'm done with this. And you declared war on the bitterness by blessing.
It was tears of joy that were flowing then.
Yeah.
Once I had blessed that person, yes. And I'm sure that person felt.
And you've had a couple connections now since then with them.
Yes.
How'd that go?
Awesome. Like the positive connections there, and
No more separation, no more
No.
distance.
and easy to speak to.
Yeah. The awkwardness is kind of gone. Yeah. Yeah. That's a miracle because you spent a while in that old way.
Yes.
Yeah. She came to me the next Sunday and she goes, Pastor, last Sunday, I got to tell you what happened to me. She shared with me that story. God is able to deliver us, but we need to step out in obedience to his Spirit when he speaks to us. So I'm not sure and I use this as an example, and I thank you for coming and sharing that as an example. Because what we don't want we usually talk about, the big sins and the things that separate, but you could hear the characteristics of that bitterness. It separate, it distanced them, caused division, caused that feeling of, I don't like it, that's the enemy's work and when he's working. But God works in ways to bless. And we allow his Spirit, we listen, we're obedient to him, he'll move us away from that stuff, that old stuff that's destructive, and towards something that's constructive and has life. Thank you for sharing. Would you thank her? Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to call up the worship team. We're going to conclude this morning. I'm not sure what it is that has got you locked down, but bitterness can be a real burden. I asked her, I forgot to ask you, what has been life after? And she said, it's like the burden's been lifted. And this secondhand offense, and I've said this before, bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick. A secondhand offense is someone who prepares a hand grenade for someone, pulls the pin, and gives it to a friend to throw. It never reaches its intended target. It goes off in the face of the person that's supposed to throw it. Secondhand offense when it's passed on. I've had people say, they did this to me. And truth of the matter was, when we were able to find it was nothing that they did it to a loved one. The person who has offended this person is the loved one that shared the offense with them, because they can't do anything with it. Sharon was able to break free from this bitterness and the chains, that burden, by just being obedient to the Spirit of God. He can set free today. We should not just talk or sing about loving or serving God. We need to do it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. What do you spend your time, your strength on? The thing about bitterness or sin, it sucks up our time and energy, our focus, our thoughts. It uses it up on things which are destructive. As we turn our attention to God, make Him our affection, make Him our focus, make Him our attention, then we're able to apply our strength, our energy, our time, our thoughts onto things that have purpose, that have meaning. Not just talk about loving God, really love Him and serve Him. Now, you may be sitting here today and saying, I'm weary, I'm tired. Temptation has a way of sapping you of your strength. Here's good news. He gives strength. Isaiah says, He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. And so if you find yourself weak facing temptation, you can know today, and when I was coming into this text in James and felt like God put on my heart to share with you as I preached about temptation, was not to have you leave feeling weak, but to have you know the good news that you can prepare yourself for the time of temptation, that you can be strong in a time of temptation. You do not need to be weary and weak so that you will always yield to it, the victim. But you can face temptation with a strength, knowing that you can be victorious. Even youth grows tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. So is God the desire of your heart, your passion, your soul, the focus of your mind? You will face and I will face temptation. But today you can prepare yourself for the day of temptation by loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Would you stand with me?